Hello and welcome to this first video in our lecture on remote user authentication. In the past couple lectures, we've been discussing the topic of user authentication without specifying the details of the circumstances of the authentication. In particular, most of the scenarios we discussed in the past have involved or could have involved a user standing directly in front of a sensor or an authentication system and inputting the information directly into the system. But in this lecture, we're going to focus on a scenario where the user and the authentication service are at a distance from each other. They're communicating through a communication link. So instead of having a person or user standing in front of their desktop computer at home or directly in front of the ATM machine and entering their PIN into it, we're going to consider the case where the user and the authentication service are distant from each other and they're communicating through either the internet or any kind of network communication link. So in this scenario, there are additional threats that we need to be aware of, such as the attacker eavesdropping on the communications link itself to capture, say, the password entered by the user, or it could be the adversary not only eavesdropping but capturing some of this information and storing it and using it later, say, to impersonate the user. So several approaches to protect against these attacks exist. In this lecture, we're going to focus on one kind of defense mechanism called the challenge response protocol. We gave a quick example of such protocols in a previous lecture, but we're going to discuss it in more depth in this lecture. So this slide shows a general taxonomy of possible attacks on remote user authentication systems. In the first column, we see a list of 6 possible categories of attacks. These attacks are based on mostly the focus or the location of the attack, whether it's on the client side or the other side, meaning the host side of the authentication service, or on the communication link between the client and the host. And then we have also 3 other kinds of attack that we're going to talk a little bit more detail in this slide. So where you see the 6 categories of attacks, more or less identical to the ones on the previous slide. Now remember, the scenario for this lecture is that we have a communication link that connects 2 systems, one that we can call the client and the other one the server, just to reuse the standard client server terminology. So this is the end where the user is located, and this is the end where the authentication service, sometimes called the host, is located. So the main categories of attack are client attacks. So this is a scenario where we have an attacker that directly targets the client side. So typical examples of client attacks include the attacker stealing the password of the user, for example, through a social engineering attack, or maybe the attacker stealing the physical token of a user. Another example is the video that I referred you to in the previous lecture, the Mythbuster episode where they were stealing someone's fingerprints and then recreating a fake, copy of that biometric characteristic and then using it to impersonate the user on the client side, on the sensor at a door. So these are client attacks because, again, they focus on this side of the communication link. Another kind of attacks that also typically target the client side would be a Trojan horse. So a Trojan horse is any kind of hardware or software system that looks like the authentic hardware or software system that the user would use, but is actually performing extra actions above and beyond what the original authentic system is supposed to do. And in particular, the Trojan horse looks like the original authentication system, but actually involves like stealing the data input by the user. So such a system would be like a fake ATM keyboard, that's put on top of the original one, or maybe a keylogger that's inserted on the client side to steal the user's input characters, say in their password. Okay, then we have attacks that are going to be focused on the other end of the communication link, which is the host. So in these attacks, the attacker again is trying to steal some information. In this case, it would be the stored or the system password file stored on the server in a case of a password-based system, or the attacker could be trying to steal the stored template in the database of the authentication service using biometrics. And then we have attacks that focus on the communication links. So this would be an eavesdropping attack or packet sniffing, where the attacker can tap into the link and basically reads the packets that are sent along this link, including maybe the encrypted password of the user. Eavesdropping could also take place on the client side by, say, shoulder surfing, and the attacker trying to read the password that the user is inputting into the system. And then another kind of attack that focuses both on the communication link and the server side is a replay attack, where first that's a two-stage attack where the attacker first not only reads but stores packets that they intercepted on the communication links, and then they replay those packets later and send them to the server, maybe impersonating the client, pretending to be the client connecting to the same server later on, but by replaying or resending earlier packets that they stole or they sniffed on the network link. And then a completely different type of attack, because this attack is not necessarily trying to steal the credentials of a user, but is to attack the or breach the availability of the system. It's called the denial of service attack. So in this case, the attacker is trying to prevent the user from authenticating themselves to the system at all. And so a couple of ways to do that would be first to flood the host or the server with so many authentication requests that the server is overwhelmed and either shuts down completely or is so slow that no actual user can authenticate themselves. So this would be an attack that would target the entire server and that would disable it for all possible users. Or another denial of service type of attack would be the attacker targeting a specific user and basically impersonating the user and trying to authenticate themselves by, say, randomly trying many possible passwords to the point where so many attempts have been made in a short amount of time that the server detects a potential attack and just locks out the user altogether, which is now not able to authenticate themselves at all. So this was a quick overview of the possible attacks in a scenario in which we have remote user authentication. And in the rest of this lecture, we're going to focus on ways to protect against such attacks.